I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the library lectures. We welcome students, colleagues, and invited guests here today to our House of Learning lecture with Professor Gary Bryner from the Department of Political Science. His address is entitled Ecology and Theology, Christian Perspectives on Environmental Stewardship. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series: the House of Learning lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together scholars and students to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning lecture series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. Now about today's speaker. Professor Bryner is a highly accomplished scholar in the fields of political science and public policy. He earned bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from the University of Utah, a PhD in political science from Cornell, and a JD at the BYU Law School. A professor in the political science department at BYU since 1982, Professor Bryner is well respected in his field of environmental public policy, and has published books and articles on environmental governance, coal bed methane development in Wyoming, water policy in the West, and control of greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to his scholarship, Professor Bryner is a role model for young minds, encouraging thoughtful inquiry, reasoned conclusions, and lifelong discipleship. In 2004, he was named Professor of the Year by the BYU chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, the National Political Science Honor Society. It is a pleasure to welcome today a friend and colleague, Professor Gary Bryner.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ross, for that prayer. And thank you all for coming. One of the obvious challenges in talking about the environment on a beautiful day like this is that everyone who really appreciates the environment ought to be outside enjoying it. And so I appreciate your willingness to forego that for a few minutes before you have a chance to go outside. I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak in the library and to be part of this series. And I'm grateful for all those who have written and spoken about of the variety of topics that have been addressed here, but in particular, the intersection of ecology and environment. And in particular, I think of the many provocative and important writings from our late colleague Hugh Nibley, bringing to our attention his own views as well as the views of Brigham Young and Joseph Smith on the environment-related topics. And so we could do no better than just to pause for a minute and think about all the things that we've learned from Brother Nibley over the years and express our gratitude for the remarkable life and scholarship. Some of the ideas that I want to talk about today really are rooted in the opportunity that I've had, as you have had, to learn from him. I want to make three arguments in my presentation. Let me lay them out, and then I'll talk about them in some detail. First, while it's true that there are some positive signs that environmental conditions are improving, the threats to current and future generations from air and water pollution, disruptive climate change, toxic chemicals, unsustainable resource use are daunting, and they compel us to act much more aggressively than we have been to conserve and protect the environment. Our environment is clearly at risk. Second, advocates of protecting the environment have much in common with people of faith and religions as they think about these trends. Both groups, both environmentalists and people of faith, look at the world from the perspective of moral imperatives. Both are motivated by values that go beyond economic self-interest. Both warn of the hazards of excessive materialism and overconsumption. Both seek to balance the needs of current generations with the needs of those to come after us. While there are at times tension between environmentalists and people of faith, I'm convinced there are great opportunities and that the similarities outweigh any differences between the two groups. The third point I want to make is that Christianity has much to offer our world in developing an ethic of environmental care and stewardship. Members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in particular find in our sacred texts many scriptural imperatives to be wise stewards, but such commitments often require trade-offs that are difficult to make. We have much to learn from others who share with us a belief in the sacredness of creation and our obligation to care for the planet for current and future generations, and who offer to us examples of environmental stewardship that I want to talk about. First, then, briefly, a review of global environmental trends. We're well into the 21st century, but we are profoundly affected by all that's happened in the 20th century, a period of remarkable human achievement, growth, and progress, but also daunting problems. This is the last picture of the Earth taken as a whole by a human being from space, photographed by the crew of Apollo 17 in December 1972. It was taken during the only time during the 4 years of Apollo flights when the sun was lined up directly behind the moon, so the Earth, rather than being partly covered in darkness, was completely illuminated. The photo is viewed by many as a major motivation for environmental protection. It showed a shimmering, vibrant, living Earth against a massive, black, lifeless universe. But the 20th century left for us a number of challenges. A series of reports by a variety of groups, scientists, and advocates have identified a tremendous number of risks and challenges. And let me just, rather than talking about them, because you're probably all familiar with those, but let me just talk about sort of three conclusions that I think people can draw from the tremendous amount of information available concerning the state of the environment. First, we've made considerable progress in removing some forms of pollution, such as air and water contaminants, especially in the developed, the wealthy countries. But the solution to environmental problems is not simply environmental growth. Many problems are growing worse, such as greenhouse gas emissions, the loss of biodiversity, accumulation of chemicals in the environment. Our consumption of natural resources is not sustainable, especially if people in the developing world are able to increase their consumption so that they come closer to the material standard of living that we enjoy. These problems not only threaten people now, but pose a tremendous challenge as we think about the impact on life chances of future generations. Those who believe that we can grow our way out of environmental problems simply through economic growth must reject, if they believe this, the widely held conclusions drawn by environmental scientists around the world that our planet cannot sustain the current level of consumption and waste, especially if economic growth develops in the poor countries of the world. The second, the most immediate environmental problems clearly are found in the less developed countries where poverty and environmental decline are inextricably intertwined. People who struggle to survive often engage in environmental practices that are unsustainable. Those people are especially affected by environmental problems such as air and water pollution, lack of clean drinking water and sanitation, and loss of local biodiversity. Addressing these environmental problems is profoundly important moral imperative for all of us. The third point, in the past, the public has often been alarmed about environmental problems, even more so than scientists. There are examples of how the public has been concerned about fears that scientists often dismiss. But today we see the opposite happening. Most scientists are truly alarmed, worried about loss of biodiversity in the world, about the threat of climate change, and the ecological unsustainability of our patterns of consumption, while in the public seems to place very little attention and very little priority on environmental problems, as do most policymakers. In the case of climate change, for example, there are tremendous uncertainties and unknowns about the causes and consequences of disruptive climate change that clearly scare and frighten many scientists, the leading scientists, but yet those sorts of concerns haven't carried over to the public. A quote about 10 years ago from more than 1,000 of the world's leading scientists summarizes the situation. As you read this, human beings in the natural world are set on a collision course. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future that we wish for human society in the plant and animal kingdoms, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Again, we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I want to shift to talking about theology and ecology. Advocates of protecting and preserving the environment have much in common with people of faith as they respond to the kinds of trends that these scientists outlined. Ecology and theology can be mutually reinforcing, but there are some challenges that both environmentalists and people of faith face. For example, environmental analyses are often are clearly rooted in science, as are the remedies for improving sustainability. But they also have deep roots in ethical and even spiritual commitments on the part of many environmentalists. Some environmentalists, such as proponents of deep ecology, argue for a transformative view of life rooted in environmental values. Others are motivated by a fundamental commitment to preserve the earth for our future generations, to ensure that these resources are sustainable for those to come. Religious traditions hold great moral authority and are deeply influential in shaping the worldview of their adherents, motivating them to live their lives in ways consistent with the worldviews, and are effective in generating social capital, a sense of community that are so important in collective problems. They have a long history of criticizing materialism and excessive consumption, promoting social justice. We typically think of religion as a conservative social force, protecting traditional values. There's also a tradition in religion that reflects a prophetic model of criticizing and challenging the existing order, calling on believers to flee Babylon and the corrupting practices of the world. Environmentalists are typically labeled as liberals because they often favor strong environmental intervention to protect the environmental values that they care about. Many of them see environmental problems as largely problems of injustice, where the burdens of pollution largely fall on those who are already poor or politically marginalized, and they support public policies to promote a more just distribution of benefits and burdens. A commitment to environmental justice and fairness is for many environmentalists the central value that motivates them. However, many environmentalists see liberalism's emphasis on individual autonomy and freedom as a barrier to the kind of shared responsibility and community-level caring for the environment that characterizes most conservation, and argue for a more community-based ideology that emphasizes the way in which we are interconnected to each other and to the land on which we are so dependent. Although Leopold, the great conservationist, sounds much like a communitarian when he called for a land ethic that champions our commitment to each other and to the other living things around us. But conserving ecosystems is inherently a conservative task, and protecting natural systems on which life depends is surely consistent with conservative values. It's hard to reconcile conservatism with an uncritical, optimistic belief that we can solve environmental problems not by changing our behavior, but by simply developing new technologies. If conservatives simply believe there are no serious environmental problems, then inaction in this area may be acceptable. But such a view is simply hard to imagine, giving overwhelming evidence of environmental degradation. So then let me just step back for and think about how ideological labels and rigid thinking are really not very helpful here. There are clearly elements of environmental protection that are conservative, but there are clearly liberal values about equality and justice that can also be pursued, and there's an opportunity for the two sides, I think, to work together. Protecting the environment is, for environmentalists and for people of faith, a moral imperative, an economically prudent action, given the importance of the environment for our economic activity, and as a commitment to protect the earth for those who come after us. It's true there are some important tensions between environmentalists and people of faith. Some environmentalists, for example, believe that women have been denied true equality and that some religions have been at the root of this inequality. Given that that women play a critical role in population growth, education, health, nutrition, and family well-being, a belief in some religions that marginalize women would make it difficult to see religions playing a positive role in pursuing environmental protection. These two groups may differ over the place of humanity in the natural order. Some deep ecologists champion the rights of all forms of life to live, do not give humans any privileged status, for example. Other environmentalists may recognize a special role for humans, but call for heightened protection of other species that are more dependent. Some believers reject such views as inconsistent with divine nature. Despite the differences, however, environmentalists have much to gain from a science-spirit partnership in strengthening the case for protecting the environment and engaging people in making a serious commitment to changing environmentally destructive behavior. Believers have not made great inroads in challenging the materialism and consumption that dominate our lives and divert us from spiritual concerns. Protecting the environment can help increase the commitment to avoiding these practices that appear to be so challenging to a life of faith. Religious belief and democratic politics can be incompatible if religious commitments are dogmatic, narrow, and exclusionary, as we sometimes see in the world. Liberal secularists who oppose any public role for religion are similarly narrow in their politics. Religious-based arguments can be inclusive and democratic, as they have been in other progressive causes, such as the civil rights movement, women's suffrage, and the abolition of slavery. Prophetic religion based on deep moral convictions, can contribute to democratic discourse as it competes with other ideas in the public sphere, rather than seeking to impose religious values as fundamental religionists in some cases have tried to do. Let me just review then the arguments. The way in which we can bridge the ecological theological gap. Both sides, I think, are committed to these norms of justice, fairness, and values. Both of them warn about the consequences of overconsumption. Both sides are deeply committed to the perpetuation of life and the obligation to succeeding generations. And both sides recognize the importance of a sense of community and working together. So that's the first sort of major point I want to make here, that I really think there's an opportunity for people of faith and environmentalists to see that their similarities are much greater than some significant differences that nevertheless divide them. And it's important to recognize that uniting environmentalism and faith is not something new. John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, wrote a century ago of his experience in the wildlands of California. Perched like a fly on this Yosemite dome, I gaze and sketch and bask, humbly prostrate before the vast display of God's power, eager to offer self-denial and renunciation with eternal toil to learn any lesson in the divine manuscript. Well then, let me, in conclusion, turn to a discussion of Christian perspectives on environmental stewardship. First of all, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as I think we are probably all familiar, find much in the scriptures and in prophetic statements concerning the role of protecting the environment. First, the earth and all creation belong to God. They witness and reflect his power and love for humankind. The earth has a celestial future, and we have an opportunity to help renew and replenish it. Moses chapter 6, we read, all things are created and made to bear record of me, both things which are temporal and things which are spiritual, things which are in the heavens above and things which are on the earth. All things bear record of me. In section 50, sorry, that should be D and C, section I, I'm sorry. Yea, all things which come of the earth and the season thereof are made for the benefit and use of man, both to please the eye and gladden the heart, food for raiment, for taste and for smell, to strengthen the body and to enliven the soul. And it pleaseth God that he giveth all these things unto man, for unto this end were they made to be used, with judgment not to excess, neither by extortion. The second principle we find in the scriptures, humans have a sacred stewardship to protect and preserve creation for themselves and for succeeding generations. In section 104, we read, a commandment I give unto you, that you shall organize yourselves and appoint every man his stewardship, that every man may give an account unto me of the stewardship which is appointed unto him. For it is expedient that I, the Lord, should make every man accountable as a steward over earthly blessings. I, the Lord, stretched out the heavens and built the earth, and my very handiwork, and all things therein are mine, but it must needs be done in mine own way. Behold, this is the way that I, the Lord, have decreed to provide for my saints, that the poor may be exalted, the rich may be laid low. For the earth is full, and there is enough and to spare. The third principle we find is that our use of resources should be guided by principles of equity, conservation, and minimal waste, consumption that meets our needs, and restraint in our consumption so that we can pursue spiritual values. Section 49 of the Doctrine and Covenants. The beasts of the field and fowls of the air, that which cometh of the earth, is ordained for the use of man, for food and for raiment, that he might have an abundance. But it is not given that one man should possess that which is above another, wherefore the world lieth in sin. Section 70, in your temporal things you shall be equal, and this not grudgingly, otherwise the abundance of the manifestations of the Spirit shall be withheld. And the fourth principle, materialism and overconsumption are threats to both environmental and spiritual well-being. In Luke we read, take heed and beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. In Jacob we read, before ye seek for riches, seek for the kingdom of God. After ye have obtained a hope in Christ, you shall obtain riches. If you seek them for the intent to do good, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to liberate the captive, administer relief to the sick and the afflicted. We also see in quotes from Brigham Young and one from Hugh Nibley that I'll put up in just a minute about the kind of perspective that the gospel gives us. Said Brigham Young, "The earth is very good in and of itself, has abided a celestial law. Consequently, we should not despise it, but rather desire and strive to obey the same law that the earth abides. Fields and mountains, trees and flowers, and all that flies, swim, or move upon the ground are lessons for the study in the great school of our Heavenly Father." Then Brother Nibley said, a favorite theme of Brigham Young was that the dominion God gives man is designed to test him, to enable him to show to himself, his fellows, and all the heavens just how he would act if entrusted with God's own power. If he does not act in a godlike manner, he will never be entrusted with the creation of his own, worlds without end. What can we learn from the experience of others who, like us, are trying to embrace principles of the gospel or the Christian principles as they understand them, in trying to understand what our obligations are for the environment? For example, many religious groups are arguing that climate change is an issue of public morality and justice. This is a natural argument for people of faith to make, given their concern about the way in which materialism and excessive consumption threaten spiritual values, and how the destruction of the natural world is for them an affront to the Creator. Much like religious groups played a key role in framing civil rights as a profoundly moral issue, they're playing a similar role in making the case for the political, economic, and social changes that are required to reduce the threat of disruptive climate change. Some environmental and religious groups have already begun to form alliances in cleaning up streams and rivers, planting trees, advocating against overconsumption and materialism and other environmental problems. For example, Episcopalians in California have formed a campaign called the Regeneration Project to promote renewable energy by encouraging parishes to choose energy generated from renewable sources. The campaign has spread to several states, and the real impact of this campaign not comes just in moving towards renewable energy in houses of worship, but as members of these churches decide to promote energy efficiency and renewable energy in their own home. The Interfaith Coffee Program, for example, encourages its members to purchase only coffee that is fair traded, where farmers are guaranteed a minimum price to protect them from price swings, characteristic of many globally traded commodities, and help them receive a more stable and predictable income. It also encourages them to engage in ecologically sustainable farming practices. It's grown to more than 3,500 congregations. That's only about 1% of the total of the United States, but individual members make a modest adjustment in their purchasing practices. As one participant in the coffee program put it, our consumer dollars are hurting the very people our offering dollars are trying to help. What if those of us who are addicted to chocolate agreed to get our fix from farmers who were guaranteed a minimum and stable price and who practice environmentally friendly farming practices? Another example, the Evangelical Environmental Network promotes conservation and environmental stewardship because of a belief that the natural world is God's creation and must be protected. It played a key role in blocking efforts in 1986 to weaken the Endangered Species Act, calling the act Noah's Ark of our day. And the most recent one, in February 2006, 86 leaders of the evangelical movement issued a public statement supporting strong policy actions to reduce the threat of climate change. Their statement made 4 arguments. First, human-induced climate change is real. The consequences of climate change will hit the poor the hardest. Third, Christian moral convictions demand our response to the climate change problem. And fourth, there's an urgent need to act now. Their moral conviction in their statements emphasized a loving God and all he created, being good stewards over the earth, protecting and caring for the most vulnerable above us. With the same love of God and neighbor that compels us to reach salvation through Jesus Christ, they wrote, protect unborn life, preserve the family and the sanctity of marriage, defend religious freedom and human dignity, and take the whole gospel to a hurting world, we resolve to come together with others of like mind to pray and to work and to stop global warming. It should be noted that the National Association of Evangelicals has not taken a stand as a whole on the issue of global climate change, as other leaders in the movement disagree with these 86 leaders and with the scientific bodies and scientific groups that they base their argument on, arguing instead, the other group, that human efforts to stop climate change are, quote, largely futile and would divert resources for more beneficial efforts. Finally, I want to close with statements from 2 scientists who are not of our faith, but who wrote a paper to chemists and engineers, trying to help them understand the environmental the ecological, ethical, religious connection. They wrote, materialism and excessive consumption, overconsumption, have an environmental consequences, but also spiritual ones. Overconsumption represent both spiritual and environmental impacts of production, marketing, consumption, and disposal of goods and services that go well beyond basic needs, overwhelm the ability of ecosystems to absorb and disperse wastes and regenerate, have toxic effects on living organisms and extinguish some forms of life, inequitably share risks and benefits, consume resources that could be used by others, and consume non-renewable resources that are not available for future generations. They wrote, continuing, powerful forces contribute to overconsumption, politics and economics, and the emphasis on growth, engineering and technology, marketing and businesses. This is a dilemma for Christian politicians, engineers, and business executives, as well as voters, consumers, and families. To what extent do we want to contribute to overconsumption? Materialism represents self-indulgence and encourages divided loyalties between God and possessions, and distract us from the pursuit of God and his kingdom. This is not to argue against technology or to believe that we can somehow live and thrive without modern technology. To reject technology would cause profound harm and suffering. Through our understanding of Jesus Christ, we can be good stewards and manage the earth responsibly, and not just for our immediate short term. But technology is not our savior. He is, and we rely on him and not on technology. Technicism is the attempt to locate technical solutions to spiritual problems. Instead, we can seek designs that are spiritually uplifting, appeal to our spirit, and produce social benefits. Be ecologically sustainable. Can identify risks and reduce them, look out for the welfare of others, for all living things, help influence public policy, and reconsider our lifestyle. Live consistent with our principles of voluntary restraint and simplicity. As I think about this example of my colleagues who are not of our faith, but who take their ideas so seriously, I'm reminded of a statement that President Kimball made several years ago. I think it's probably now close to 30 years when he wrote this essay. He said, "The Lord has blessed us as a people with prosperity unequaled in times past. The resources that we have placed in our power are good and necessary to our work here on the earth. But I am afraid that many of us have been surfeited with flocks and herds and acres and barns and wealth and have begun to worship them as false gods, and they have power over us. Do we have more of these good things than our faith can stand? As the Lord himself said in our day, they seek not the Lord to establish his righteousness, but every man walketh in his own way, after the image of his own God, whose image is the likeness of the world, and whose substance is that of an idol, which waxeth old and shall perish in Babylon, even Babylon the Great, which shall fall." It may seem a little difficult at first, but when a person begins to catch a vision of the true work, when he begins to see something of eternity in its true perspective, the blessings begin to far outweigh the cost of leaving the world behind. Thank you very much for coming. I'm looking forward to a chance now. I tried to talk as fast as I could so we would have time to talk, and I'm interested in hearing your comments and ideas and suggestions. Thank you.